Imagine being on the receiving end of an encounter with a police officer who, instead of protecting and serving, becomes a force of aggression and arrogance. This isn't just any routine traffic stop or minor dispute. It's a moment that will change everything for one officer and teach him a lesson he'll never forget. John, an ordinary guy just going about his day, suddenly finds himself in a dangerous situation when an officer pulls him over. At first, it seems like just another minor confrontation, but it quickly escalates. The officer, clearly full of his own authority, starts throwing around threats, insults, and even pulls out his gun. Yes, you heard that right. He pulls a gun on John, who is left to wonder, what did he do to deserve this? The power dynamic between the two seems unshakable at first. The officer feels untouchable, while John, though shaken, refuses to back down. But what happens next? The situation takes an unexpected twist, one that will leave you questioning who's really in control. As the tension builds and the officer's arrogance reaches new heights, John finds himself caught between fear and the realization that this encounter might just be the one that teaches the officer a lesson he never saw coming. With lives at stake and emotions running high, how will this standoff end? This is just the beginning of an incredible story, one filled with unexpected turns, an expensive lesson for an arrogant cop, and a reminder that no one is invincible. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how this plays out. John had no idea what he was getting into that day. He had just finished a long shift at work, tired and ready to get home. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting a golden glow across the street as he drove down a quiet road. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive, but then the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror, and the peaceful evening was shattered in an instant. He pulled over, his hands instinctively gripping the steering wheel. He tried to stay calm, but a knot formed in his stomach. The officer approached with a swagger, head high, chest out, almost like he owned the road. John didn't think much of it at first, maybe a speeding ticket or a minor infraction. But as the officer leaned in, his tone was anything but routine. "You know why I stopped you?" He barked, his voice sharp, almost taunting. John was caught off guard, trying to explain that he wasn't speeding, but the officer wasn't having it. The words that came next were loaded with an arrogance John had never experienced before. The officer started accusing him of things he didn't do, aggressively questioning John's behavior, almost daring him to protest. It felt wrong, but John, trying to de-escalate, kept his voice calm. That's when the officer's attitude turned even darker. "You don't get to question me," he sneered, his hand moving toward his sidearm. The gun was suddenly there, visible, cold metal glinting in the dimming light. John's heart raced. His mind went blank for a second. Was this really happening? The officer seemed to think he was invincible, like no one could touch him. But John was no pushover either. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick, each second feeling like a lifetime. What would happen next? John's pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at the officer's hand hovering over his holstered weapon. He could feel the sweat gathering on his brow, but he forced himself to stay still. This was no longer about a traffic stop. It was something much bigger. He'd heard the rumors, seen the stories on the news, but he never imagined he'd be part of one. Not like this. The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning John's face like he was trying to gauge whether the man was going to challenge him further. John could feel the officer's sense of superiority in the air, like a cloud of arrogance that hung between them. It was obvious the officer had no interest in hearing John's side of the story. He wasn't even pretending to listen anymore. His posture was rigid, aggressive, like a wolf sizing up its prey. John's hands were still gripping the steering wheel, but his mind was racing. Was this really happening? Then, in a flash, everything seemed to slow down. John didn't even know where the words came from, but they slipped out of his mouth before he could stop them. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice quieter than he intended, but firm. He wasn't sure if the officer hurt him, or if he just didn't care. But John could see something flicker behind his cold, steely eyes. A moment of hesitation, Or was it just a cruel game the officer was playing to keep him on edge? The officer took a step closer, his voice dropping low, barely above a whisper. "You don't tell me what to do. You're nothing but a civilian who thinks he knows better." John's mind screamed for him to think fast. He knew he was at a crossroads. Any wrong move could make this situation spiral out of control. He tried to breathe, tried to focus, but it was hard with the gun still in view, like a silent threat hanging over him. John could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the intense pressure. Was the officer going to follow through? Would he really fire? It wasn't just the gun that unsettled John. It was the power the officer held. It wasn't just about the uniform. It was the mentality. The belief that, as a cop, he could do whatever he wanted. He could break the rules and still walk away unscathed. But what if John didn't just stand there? What if he wasn't the kind of guy who let himself be pushed around? In that moment, something shifted in John. He wasn't sure if it was courage or desperation, but he knew he had to do something. He had to make the officer see that he wasn't some person to be toyed with. His eyes darted to the side, searching for any escape. But this wasn't about running away. This was about standing up, about showing that no one, not even a cop, was beyond accountability. Meanwhile, in the officer's mind, things weren't as clear-cut. He'd made his move, pulled out his weapon, but there was something gnawing at him now. He wasn't used to being challenged. Sure, he'd dealt with defiant civilians before, but this was different. John wasn't breaking down, wasn't pleading. And in the officer's gut, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this time he wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The tension thickened, the seconds dragged on, and neither of them moved. It felt like the world around them had gone silent, frozen in place. John didn't know how much longer he could stand it. Would the officer snap? Would John's words be enough to diffuse the situation? Or was this the moment everything went wrong? The silence stretched on, suffocating, each passing second feeling like an eternity. John's heart thundered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He couldn't afford to break eye contact with the officer. Not now. Not when everything felt so fragile. His breath was shallow, but he fought to control it, to keep his voice steady. The officer still hadn't made a move, and in that moment, it felt like anything could happen. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. John's mind raced. What if the officer snapped? What if the gun went off? What would happen to him? And worse, what would happen to his family, his friends? He tried to remind himself that he had no control over the officer's actions, but something inside him refused to back down. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear. But as the seconds ticked by, he knew he couldn't just stand there in fear. Not again. The officer's grip on his weapon tightened, just slightly, but it was enough for John to notice. His hand shook slightly, a small but noticeable tremor. John couldn't tell if it was from rage, or if the officer was uncertain now. Was he starting to doubt himself? Or was it a warning, a sign of just how volatile the situation had become? Either way, the officer's power was slipping, but John could feel it. There was no going back now. "You're making a mistake," John said, his voice rough but still calm. He wasn't pleading. It was more of a statement, like he knew something the officer didn't. His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the officer looked almost human, vulnerable even. But then, just as quickly, the arrogance came rushing back. The officer's lip curled, and his stance grew more aggressive. "Shut your mouth," he growled, his hand gripping the gun tighter. John's pulse spiked again. This wasn't just an angry cop anymore. It was someone losing control, someone who had too much power and was starting to panic. And panic made people unpredictable. The air between them crackled with potential danger. John's mind went blank. There had to be something he could do, some way to get through to this man. He couldn't just let this escalate further. It was all happening too fast, and yet, the stakes had never felt higher. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, some miracle, maybe, or a shift in the officer's attitude, but the tension was reaching its breaking point. Any wrong word, any wrong move, and this could end in disaster. In that moment, everything seemed to align in a way John couldn't explain. The officer's attention shifted ever so slightly, maybe just a second's worth of distraction, but it was enough. Was the officer starting to waver? Did John have a chance to turn this around? Or was this his final moment before everything spiraled completely out of control? The answer was still unclear, but in the pit of his stomach, John could feel that something was about to snap, one way or another. Just as John thought the officer might be wavering, the sound of a car door slamming shut shattered the fragile moment of stillness. John's head whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. A second officer, another cop, was approaching from behind, walking briskly toward the scene. John's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a bad encounter anymore. This was escalating into something far worse. The second officer was younger, less experienced, but there was no mistaking the confident, almost eager way he moved. He hadn't even seen what was happening yet, didn't know the tension that had built between John and the first officer. But it didn't matter. His arrival changed everything. "Everything all right here, Paul?" The second officer's voice was casual, as if he hadn't just walked into a potentially explosive situation. He looked at the first officer, the one with the gun still in his hand, but there was something in his eyes, something that didn't sit right. His gaze flicked briefly to John before locking back on the officer with the weapon. For a split second, the first officer, Paul, looked conflicted. There was a flicker in his eyes, almost like a recognition that he was no longer in control of the situation. He wasn't alone anymore. And John, despite being the one with a gun pointed at him, realized that things were slipping further out of his hands. The younger officer was eager, no hesitation in his movements, and John could feel the shift in the air. "Yeah, everything's fine," Paul said quickly, his voice tight, the words coming out like a reflex. But the second officer's sharp eyes were already narrowing as he studied John, sizing him up. He was already drawing conclusions, likely that John had done something wrong, or worse, that he was a threat. John's chest tightened. He couldn't afford to let things spiral. He had just managed to hold onto a shred of control with the first officer, and now this new guy was about to throw everything out of balance. His hand, which had been resting by his side, suddenly felt like it was in the wrong place. Did they see his slight movement? Did they think he was reaching for something? The younger officer's eyes flicked to Paul's gun, and then back to John. It was clear he was trying to figure out what the deal was. Should he back up his partner? Should he take over? John felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure how this would play out. The situation was turning into a powder keg, and it felt like everyone, including these two officers, was on edge. "You need to step out of the car, sir," the second officer said suddenly, his voice more commanding than before. The words sent a chill through John. "What for?" John asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but inside, his mind raced. His thoughts were scattered. What was happening? How could this be turning into something worse? The younger officer ignored him, his hand now resting on his taser, ready to draw if needed. "Step out of the vehicle, now." John's instincts screamed at him to refuse, but he wasn't sure if that would help. The officer was already making his move. Was this part of the plan? Was he going to escalate things just like Paul had? His mind spun with possibilities, and with both officers watching, waiting for him to react, the stakes had never been higher. One wrong move, and this entire night could go from bad to catastrophic in the blink of an eye. John sat there, still in shock, the engine idling as the world around him slowly started to make sense again. The night, which had started with such a simple drive, had turned into something he'd never forget. He could hear the faint sound of the officer's car pulling away, the sudden quietness enveloping him. But that final statement, the suited man's words, echoed in his mind. You weren't the only one being watched. Who had been watching him? Was he being investigated? Had the higher-ups known something he didn't? And why had this all happened in the first place? His mind swirled with questions, but there was something else too, something that felt oddly empowering. John had stood his ground, refused to back down, and somehow it had worked. The officers had underestimated him. They thought they had control, but in the end, it was clear that sometimes the system could be challenged, even by the most ordinary of people.